expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
And welcome to our weekly live edition of Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr. Well, it's been another day of fast-moving events in Egypt. President Hosni Mubarak now has stepped down. He's left Cairo for his resort home in Sharm el-Sheikh. All of that's touched off quite a celebration in Tahrir Square. Our correspondent Terry McCarthy is in Egypt. He's been there for several days now. Terry, what is the reaction this morning there?
Well, it's been an extraordinary street party. You've got to remember that they thought last night that Mubarak was going to step down. Then he gave a speech when he said he was staying on. People got very angry. There were enormous demonstrations throughout the city today. Mubarak clearly realized he'd lost the control of the streets completely. And then when it was announced that he was stepping down, it's this extraordinary street party, people rioting almost in joy throughout the streets, and particularly in Tahrir Square. You said last night, you used the phrase kind of a whiplash, an emotional whiplash. I guess now people are being whipped back the other direction. That's right. They almost thought they had the prize last night. Then they were excited. Then again, this morning they showed their anger. They were back out on the streets, and now they're back into a rejoicing mode. It's been an extraordinary 24 hours for the Egyptian people. Is it clear to the people there, Terry, who's in charge? I guess Vice President Suleiman is still there, but is the military in charge from their perspective? Absolutely. Everyone now knows the military are in charge. Now, the military have a pretty good reputation among the Egyptian people. However, there are some fears that the military might stay in control longer than people want. They clearly want a civilian democracy here. The military has effectively been the strongest force in Egypt for 58 years. I think if the military is smart, they will step back because the people clearly want to have a civilian democracy now. We've watched some pictures through the day of the square. We see fireworks going off and people clearly in a festive mood. What happens next for the protesters? This has been an 18-day effort now. Do they just simply go home, or what's your sense of what's going to happen next? Well, I suspect they will continue partying in that square for quite some time. Just the solidarity of being with so many other people and being able to demonstrate is a pretty new experience for Egyptians. But I think, yes, you're right, that in the coming days that those people will drift back home. The whole rationale for the protests will now evaporate, and things will start to return slowly to normal. People have made a singular demand till now, saying that Mubarak must go. Now that's happened. What do they want to see happen now, though? Because reform is going to take some time. What do they want to see happen in the short term? Well, in the short term, I think they want to see a number of changes to the Constitution. They want to see the emergency law lifted. You know, Mubarak had ruled Egypt under emergency law for 30 years, which gave the police extraordinary powers to arrest without warrant and so on and so forth. They want that lifted, and the military said already today that that would be lifted when this crisis is over. Longer term, they want free and fair elections, and they want civilian leadership to take control. The elections are still, as we understand, set for September. Is any chance that's going to happen sooner? What is your sense there? I think they cannot really rush those elections because it will take them some time to make the necessary change to the Constitution. There's quite a lot of legal issues they have to work their way through. So I suspect the date of the elections will not be pulled forward. All right, Terry McCarthy reporting for us from Egypt. Thanks very much, Terry, for your insights today. Good talking about it. Let's now look at the U.S. side of this, the reaction here as to what's been happening as Mubarak steps down. Chip Reid is over at the White House for us, and David Martin, as always, joins us from the Pentagon. And David, I see you put out a note recently that's pretty interesting about how all this played out last night. Can you share that with us?
Well, this is sort of the reigning belief now among U.S. officials, and that is that Mubarak basically called an audible last night. There were many Egyptian officials who believed that he was going to resign last night, but that at the last minute he changed his mind, hardened his resolve, and instead only transferred his powers to the vice president. When the ruling regime saw that, A, that only made matters worse in the streets, and two, a number of them felt that they had been double-crossed by not resigning last night, then Mubarak had lost everything he needed to stay in power. He'd lost control of the streets, and he'd lost support within his own ruling elite. And so he had to go today.
At the end of the day, what should we call this? Is this a a coup? I mean, was this done cooperatively with Mubarak? What's your understanding?
You have to call it a military takeover. My idea of a coup is when the military takes over against the wishes of the civilian leadership. Let's for now just call this a takeover, because you get the sense that at the end there, Mubarak had finally accepted reality. There was a very interesting interview with a former Israeli defense minister who said he talked to Mubarak by phone last night a couple hours before the speech. And he thought from talking to Mubarak that he was just looking for a face-saving way out. He knew the end had come. Now he just wanted to do it as gracefully as he could. So Mubarak was not totally oblivious to reality here.
Let me bring in Chip real quick from the White House. Chip, this has been a rough stretch for the administration, too. A lot of criticism of the way the administration has handled this with their responses. We saw what the president said yesterday. Then last night saw a pretty stern written statement. What's the mood over there now?
Well, it's hard to get much from the White House right now because the president's going to be speaking, or at least he's scheduled to speak in less than an hour. That time may be a little bit flexible, so nobody wants to upstage him. But I can tell you what Joe Biden said a little while ago. He's giving a speech today down in Kentucky, and he said this is an historic day, a pivotal moment in Middle East history and history in general. So they certainly see this as a really major moment. By the way, the president found out while he was in a meeting in the Oval Office. He then stepped out with some aides into what they call the outer Oval Office and watched it on TV for a while. I asked Robert Gibbs if the president had made any calls to Mubarak to try to push him over the edge on this, and he did not. They were sticking with their theory that the president and Gibbs have voiced over and over again that this is a decision for the Egyptian people to make. It's not a decision that President Obama or the American people should make, who should be in charge in Egypt.
That said, though, tell me a little bit about the statement that came out last night. After President Mubarak spoke, it was clear the White House was irritated. That was pretty tough language.
Oh, absolutely. He was deeply disappointed, obviously. Earlier in the day, he had talked about what a transformative moment this was when he was under the impression, and everybody was under the impression that, or just about everybody was under the impression that Mubarak was going to step down. And the statement last night was the toughest one that we've heard from him yet. Well, we didn't hear. We had it on paper, but it was tough. And I think you were going to get another statement like that, perhaps even stronger today, if Mubarak had not stepped down. Now I think it's going to be a combination of talking about what an historic occasion this is, but also I think that they're going to have to shift from holding Mubarak's feet to the fire to holding the Egyptian military's feet to the fire. I don't think they want to let a day go by where they're not reminding the Egyptian military that this is a temporary measure on a path to democracy.
And on that point, let me go back to David. David, you've made the point in the past that the government here feels like the Egyptian military has acted very professionally. Is that still the view?
Yes, it is still the view, but you have to remember that the Egyptian military, their number one interest here is stability. They're not out to create a democratic revolution in Egypt. They are out to do as much as they can to restore stability, because their worst case scenario is having to use violence against the protesters, and that would just ruin this respected position they hold in Egyptian society, and also it would probably ruin their relationship with the U.S. military, which is a relationship that brings them $1.3 billion a year. So they're still walking this line, but they don't have this great tradition of democracy within the Egyptian military, so they're going to be, I think, very, very cautious in how they do this.
And in that regard, then the U.S. military will remain, I would think, in pretty constant contact there.
They would, and I'm sure offering any kind of support they can. But my sense of these conversations that both the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have had with their counterparts in Egypt is not that they're telling them what they have to do. I mean, that would be insulting. These are senior figures in their own government, and the U.S. simply cannot give them orders. And the U.S., as we have seen, is surprised by events there. It does not have real-time information about what the inner circle is thinking there.
And finally, one more question to Chip. Chip, Is there kind of an overall sense at the White House that that this is going to be all right now? I mean, that they've kind of gotten through the rough patch?
Well, I think it's that old cautiously optimistic. You know, this is one thing, one big part of the problem out of the way, but a long path to go before you have anything remotely resembling democracy in Egypt.
And of course, the president will, as you say, will talk more about this today.
That's right.
All right, Chip Reid at the White House, David Martin at the Pentagon. As always, thanks. And now I'm joined by Ambassador Edward Peck, who worked with the Foreign Service in Egypt and Tunisia, and also with David Schenker, who's the Program Director of Arab Politics at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thanks to both of you for coming. Ambassador Peck, let me start with you. So President Mubarak has stepped down. It looks like the military, for now, is running what's left of his government. What happens next?
As you know, sir, the hardest thing to predict is the future. But, you know, if they leave Mr. Suleiman in charge, I don't think that the people of Egypt are going to be satisfied, because you've changed Mubarak for somebody who is even more inclined to a rather strict interpretation of authorities and responsibilities. He's a tough guy. He's been involved in a number of things that the Egyptian people do not like, and, as you know, involved with supporting the CIA in rendition and torture and this kind of thing. It's kind of a slimy background for somebody who's going to be in charge for as ever long as the military leaves him. And he does have a military background himself.
He clearly is identified by the people there as part of the regime.
That is correct. And yes, and he's a tough guy. He makes Mubarak look like a fuzzy puppy in terms of his view of what the country should be run, how it should be run.
David Schenker, it's been interesting to watch the U.S. side of this. Just about every day they're putting out some kind of position and then at times pulling it back and amending it. How can it be that this government's been so far behind the information curve?
We just don't have the type of insight that one would expect given the type of relationship we've had with Egypt all these years. You know, certainly there's a problem with insight into the military. You know, $2 billion a year, now $1.3 billion, hundreds of Egyptians that we train, we have exercises, and yet we have no insight into the military. And very clearly, even on the civilian side, as we heard last night, the announcement that Mubarak would step down, we didn't even know that was coming, that he would stay in place. I think that our visibility is low, and we're just reading the newspapers like everybody else.
But how can that be, Ambassador? This is our most important Arab ally. It's been the pivot point for trying to broker peace in the Middle East. How can it be that we don't have a better, closer understanding of what's going on there?
I think that one of the problems that Mr. Mubarak faced, and I have not spoken with him in a long time, he used to be able to recognize me in a small crowd, and now he would have no possibility of that. But one of the problems that he faces is that the Egyptian people, for reasons which are understandable, do not like the policies of the Egyptian government in terms of its acquiescence in and occasionally support for what's happening to the Palestinians right next door. They don't like it for reasons rational or otherwise, and they resent the fact that they are seen as toadies, if you will, and being jerked around by the American puppet masters, and that's why Mubarak said several times, I don't want to be pushed from outside. You know, that's not your business, guys. So that one of the changes that's going to transpire, and I notice that officials in Israel are concerned about this too, is they may lose an important, if not ally, at least someone who stood with them in a lot of the things that they were doing, which Arabs don't like, understandably.
Among the other Arab nations, I mean, how is this viewed? In one sense, it looks like we're throwing an ally under the bus in cutting from Mubarak. How does that play with the other monarchies and the autocrats in the area?
Well, very clearly, I think Saudi Arabia and our friends in the Gulf are concerned. Perhaps even King Abdullah of Jordan would be concerned about the direction that U.S. policy has taken vis-a-vis Egypt. You know, at first it seemed that we were going to stand by Mubarak, and then we got with the crowd, and then we moved back and tried to toe this untenable line, not recognizing, I think, what most Egyptians had recognized, which was that 30 years of this is just too much. We were slow to get on the boat. But now in these countries, Saudi Arabia is looking and saying, hey, what if these people come out in the street in my country? Where is this administration going to stand? So I think there's a shaking of confidence of our friends in the region. Not necessarily because in the end we went with the Democrats and not with Mubarak, but because we are not sure-footed on this, where we seem to be all over the map.
The message has not been consistent. The policy has not been apparently consistent.
Dynamic vacillation. But, you know, it's so much of it is for public consumption, where the people say, the president, you got to do something. But whatever he does is wrong in the eyes of somebody in this country and wrong in the eyes of somebody over there, because, difficult to understand, this is not our decision to make.
So the U.S. obviously standing on the side of democracy here, but now we have a military running a sovereign state. And how do we make sure what comes out the other end is something we're going to like?
Well, how do you? You don't. It's not your business. Yeah. It's not your decision.
But it's in our interest.
Right.
That's true.
In the end of the day, the Egyptian people are going to have to work through this. The military is patriotic. I don't think they want a military junta. I mean, you did have essentially a military dictatorship for 30 years with the head of the country wearing a suit. But the military does not want to be out front and have martial law indefinitely in Egypt. I think what we're going to hear in the coming hours, actually, is an announcement that they're going to form some sort of civilian council with a military member to start working on empowering a group to revisit the Constitution. The military, though, has its interests at the end of the day. They did quite well under the Mubarak regime. They had great perquisites. They don't want to see necessarily civilian control over the military. I don't think we're going to actually see that anytime soon. But they're concerned not only about the Islamists, they're concerned about the liberals, because the type of changes that are going to occur are not only going to affect us in the United States and the relationship that Egypt has with the United States, but how the military operates within Egyptian society. And I think this is the wider issue to look for in the coming weeks.
For 18 days, we've seen these protesters in Tahrir Square there, and they've had a singular demand that Mubarak has to go. Now that's happened. And I think people here may be tempted to say, oh, that's over.
Yes.
But it's just beginning.
Let's quote Winston Churchill. This is not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. And they say, yes, Mubarak is gone. Now what? Because they're faced with a difficult situation. It just takes one or two generals to say, hey, I kind of like being in charge. That's happened before. And it's certainly going to hit Mr. Suleiman hard, who has probably always been, you know, a little trickle of saliva. Hey, that's what I want is to be the head guy.
Can he stay? Can Suleiman stay?
Well, listen, I think that the crowds, it's unclear whether the crowds will go home, whether now that they've smelled blood, essentially gotten rid of Mubarak, whether they will work on sort of a de-Baathification process, as it were, in Cairo.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, they'll look at anybody who is close to the regime, so that could mean Suleiman, or it could even mean people who were slightly further away, who would be acceptable to the military. People like Ahmed Shafiq, who was former military, who is NDP, but doesn't have that sort of corruption air about him, who did good things as a minister of civil aviation. Is widely respected both within the military and in the civilian community, but just because he has the NDP moniker, this may finish him. And if it keeps on going like that and touches people like Tantawi, the head of the head of the armed forces, then we can see a real problem here. Whether at what point people will demobilize, from the streets, will go home.
In just our last minute, Ambassador, what should we watch for here? What are the key things to look for?
Well, from the American perspective, and that's really all we can do, the Egyptians will decide for themselves. The best outcome, and I think that you would agree with me, is a government that transitions into something resembling a democracy. It isn't going to be the quintessence of democracy, just like this, because it takes a while. And that the people become more or less satisfied with whatever develops and go along with it so that Egypt can evolve into something different slowly and without convulsions that affect Israel or America or Egypt or its neighbors. That's what we would look for, but we are not in a good position to influence that outcome because we have just a tattered shred in that part of the world of the respect and reliability that we used to think we enjoyed on a constant basis. It's largely gone, as a number of pundits have said.
So this is a long process, there's no question.
Yeah, I think we're looking at years.
David Schenker, Ambassador Peck, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your insights. And thanks to all of you for watching Washington Unplugged. Stay with us at CBS News for the latest developments from Egypt. I'm Bob Orr. Have a good weekend.